Welcome back to part 4 of How to Read Literature Like a Professor. In the next few slides, we're going to talk about other places where you have seen characters before, where you should recognize at least the traits of characters, archetypes, and so on and so forth. We're going to start with vampires in this one. This chapter is called Knife to Eat With You, Acts of Vampires. So vampires really should be defined by traits, according to our author, which is to say that we've got to kind of scrap this idea that they have long teeth and dark capes, like you would see maybe in the typical vampire stories. Vampirism should instead be judged by traits such as selfishness, exploitation, a refusal to accept the autonomy of others. When a character grows stronger and another character grows weaker, this is what we would consider a vampire. Um, this chapter also deals with ghosts and with doppelgangers. And I guess you should just be aware that anytime there's a ghost or a vampire, it's usually not just about being a ghost or a vampire. So keep that in mind as you are reading. An example of a vampire that's not called a vampire, at least not straightforward vampire like you might find on Twilight, would be from the Scarlet Letter. And two of the major characters, Roger Chillingsworth and Arthur Dimmesdale, are part of the study here. So Roger Chillingsworth is described as there came a glare of red light out of his eyes, as if the old man's soul were on fire, and kept on smoldering duskily within his breast. And old Roger Chillingworth was a striking evidence of a man's faculty of transforming himself into a devil. Pretty clearly, he's transforming, he's growing stronger. And who's his victim? Well, it's Arthur Dimmesdale. He's the guy that he's been harassing and following around, and because he knows his secret. And so Chillingsworth is growing stronger off of Dimmesdale. Arthur Dimmesdale is described in the final chapter this way: how feeble and pale he looked amid all his triumph. The glow which they had just before beheld burning in his cheek was extinguished. It seemed hardly the face of a man alive, with such a deathlike hue. And so we know that Chillingsworth has just ridden and ridden Dimmesdale, and finally Dimmesdale has had the life completely sucked out of him. So Chillingsworth really is a vampire. He's got the same traits that we might look for. So when you're reading literature and you see this sort of situation or the traits listed earlier, keep in mind that you probably are dealing with a vampire. Now, where have I seen her before? Our author proposes that there really is no original work of literature, that there's one story, and that's the story that is humankind, and that we just keep retelling over and over again. And because there is no original story, there's this term intertextuality. This is the relationship between stories. For example, in The Scarlet Letter, there is this idea that Hawthorne draws frequently on the Bible with all these ministers and the sin of adultery and so on and so forth. So the intertextuality between Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter and the Bible is present. You can also see in other stories where some ancient idea is brought up, maybe not ancient, but maybe some Greek idea is brought up, or Greek traits from the gods, or perhaps there's some biblical references, or maybe it's from Shakespeare, or whatever the case may be, that authors use previous works in their current works to help support and bolster their writing. So there's a story, Going After Casiato, by Tim O'Brien. Tim O'Brien writes predominantly Vietnam stories. In this book, Going After Casiato, he writes about his characters, these troop of army soldiers who fall into a hole, and one character says, "The way to get out is to fall back up." It's a kind of an odd line to throw out. You can't really fall back up, but it sounds familiar. Where have we heard this before? Where characters fall into a hole. Well, we've heard it in Alice in Wonderland. Tim O'Brien wants to give the idea that this world, this hole that they fall into, is bizarre and things don't make sense like they should. Like in Alice in Wonderland, where we've got strange characters, strange faces, strange people. He wants to portray this idea that war is very strange and bizarre and not at all logical. So, including this line, it's kind of a wink um, to Alice in Wonderland. And in a few words, O'Brien can convey a message that he could explain in a paragraph or two or three about how bizarre war is and how it doesn't make sense. But by including the link to Alice in Wonderland, we can make that connection in our minds ourselves. Another of the works that we often find present in current works include Shakespeare. Shakespeare is everywhere. If you have any doubt about some literature, if it sounds too good to be true, if it sounds clever and you're not sure where you've heard it from, good chances are that it's come from something that Shakespeare's written. Writers use what is common in a culture as a kind of shorthand, so writers can say more in a few words when they're able to make connections with us. So just a few terms that Shakespeare kind of created. He said, "To thine own self be true. With you we happy, we band of brothers." And we know there was I think it was a miniseries, the Band of Brothers. Double, double, toil and trouble. Even though it's kind of we say it somewhat regularly, it's from Shakespeare. "O Brave New World," which was a book. To be or not to be, that's the question. So you can see on this graphic here just a few of the phrases that Shakespeare first coined. Love is blind, for example, is his, or a sorry sight, or a piece of work, a wild goose chase. You know, the come what may, these are phrases that nobody has said before, at least not in this order. And Shakespeare came up with them. Fight fire with fire. Um, Not slept one wink. Knock knock, who's there? Those jokes. Shakespeare coined these phrases first. There's a reason why he's been able to last these hundreds of years. We are immersed with his life and his writings in our everyday lives. It's also really helpful when you are analyzing literature and you can pick up on the themes to try to find the relation to the theme that you're reading to what Shakespeare has written. So, for example, if you're reading a story about two families who are feuding, perhaps two of the main characters are young lovers. Well, that should spark the memory of Romeo and Juliet. If you're reading a book about jealousy, maybe you're reading a book that's really taking away from Othello. Perhaps there's a heroic character. He's full of desire for revenge and indecision. Maybe he's melancholy in nature. You're probably reading the story of Hamlet, just set in a different time, in a different place, in a different character. If you're reading a story about a power grab, or three fortune telling witches, or if there's a murder, you're probably reading Macbeth. These themes are present in most of our literature. Being able to make that link between the theme of today with the theme of Shakespeare's yesterday will help you understand the story better. So connect the dots. Let's say you see this idea of denial and betrayal, slavery and escape, loaves, flood, fishes. By this point, you might be putting two and two together, parting the waters, plagues, serpents, garden, fatted calves, 40 days, milk and honey. That's right, it is the Bible. These themes all connect together in the Bible. So the Bible is a favorite of authors. Every writer prior to sometime, in the middle of the 20th century, they had solid instruction in religion. Schools weren't required, and so if you wanted to go to school and get an education like a lot of writers did, you would go to a school that was often run in a one room schoolhouse or by a church or whatever the case may be. So our writers, you can bet, know the Bible, even if they don't agree with or follow or hold true the words of the Bible, they at least know a lot about it. So some of the popular themes that you might find in the Bible, that are in the Bible, that you might find in modern literature, is this idea of the Garden of Eden. Are there men being tempted by women? And Is there an apple or fruit symbolic of temptation, or a serpent who treats men? This idea of David and Goliath overcoming overwhelming odds, or Jonah and the whale, which is refusing to face a task and being eaten or overwhelmed by it. Job faces disasters upon disaster upon disaster, but doesn't lose faith. So if you see that kind of thing present, a story with the flood. Rain is a form of destruction. The rainbow is a promise of restoration. There are Christ figures throughout literature in the 20th century, often used ironically. The idea of the apocalypse or four horsemen. Biblical names often draw a connection between literary characters and biblical characters. So if your character is named Eve or Cain, if there's a Joseph or a Mary or a Moses, those names might indicate a personality trait that is not unique to the character in the book that you're reading, but instead unique to the character from the Bible. So literature and movies and pop culture are full of references to the Bible. Now, you may be familiar with the movie Pulp Fiction. This movie came out, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years ago now, I guess. And it is full of allusions to the Bible as well, even though it's really violent and often bloody. The scene is perhaps most famous from the movie. So let's take a look and then we'll talk about it.
Ezekiel 25:17. The path of the righteous man is beset on all sides by the iniquities of the selfish and the tyranny of evil men. Blessed is he who in the name of charity and goodwill suffers the weak to the valley of darkness, for he is proving his brother's keeper and the founder of lost children. And I will set down upon thee with great benefits.
So this scene from Pulp Fiction and Quentin Tarantino's movie, I doubt Quentin Tarantino went to seminary or studied the Bible all that much, but he's familiar with kind of an obscure verse from the Old Testament, Ezekiel 25:17. I hope you could hear that okay with the volume not turned all the way up. Religion, whether Christianity or Islam or Hinduism or whatever, is prevalent throughout our literature, and in the Western Hemisphere, Christianity is most prevalent, or Judaism. And so, be aware of that when you are reading literature, and see if you can see God or the Bible in your books. We'll pick up with the next slide in the next video.